And welcome back to Forbes Sports Money. Well, we've been covering the emerging sport of mixed martial arts for a few years now and profiled some of the businesses who have done quite well in MMA. But there have, in fact, been far more failures. The fight game is very hard to break into and even harder to stay afloat in. And that's what makes the story of Bellator Fighting Championships so impressive. The tournament-styled company launched in 2008 and is currently the second largest MMA promotion in the U.S. after the Ultimate Fighting Championship. But Bellator had to claw its way into that position. When the fights began in 2009, they were only aired on the Spanish-language version of ESPN. In 2010, their fights made it into English-speaking homes through Fox Sports Net. By 2011, much to many people's surprise, Bellator was airing fights on MTV2. And by the end of that year, MTV's parent company, Viacom, bought a majority stake in Bellator. This heavyweight deal will put Bellator fights on Spike TV in 2013 and has set the company up for international expansion. The visionary behind Bellator's rise is Bjorn Rebney, a former boxing promoter turned MMA entrepreneur. And Michael Ozanian sat down with Rebney at the Forbes offices to discuss the fight game in our Sports Money profile.
How important was it for Bellator to bring in Viacom as a partner late last year?
Oh, it was incredibly important. I mean, you talk about Viacom, you talk about reaching 600 million consumers around the world. You talk about MTV and Comedy Central and Nickelodeon and Spike Network and Paramount Pictures with Mission Impossible and countless features. You talk about 163 different networks around the world. They're just a huge entertainment powerhouse. I mean, they've got reach and connectivity to consumers literally in every corner of the globe. So in a sport like ours, it transitions all across the globe. To have a partner like Viacom, it's as good as it gets.
You founded Bellator in 2008. It's your baby, chairman, CEO. Was it hard to sell a majority stake in the company?
No, it wasn't, because when you looked at it and when I looked at kind of the plan and the maturation of the growth of the company, the ideal was to form a relationship with somebody like a Viacom. I mean, the ideal, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow was a Viacom, because they controlled Spike. And Spike wrote the book on mixed martial arts programming, not just domestically, but across the globe. So you look at a situation like that and you see, well, from a long-term success perspective, how do you get someone like that vested? How do you get them looking at it not as a renter, but as an owner? And if they're an owner, what kind of a commitment will they make to our brand to build it and to continue to take the fighters to the next level and the programming to the next level and the international distribution to the next level? And so it was the culmination of a plan and a model that I'd had in my head for many years. It was actually icing on the cake as opposed to a negative.
Bellator was the first MMA tournament to regularly use women fighters. How has that worked out?
It worked out well. It worked out well. You know, you track your quarters. You read when people are watching and when people aren't watching. You typically get those numbers 24 to 48 hours after a show concludes. And what we found is when Megumi Fujii, arguably the greatest pound-for-pound female fighter in the world from Japan, or Jessica Aguilar, or some of our stars, Zoila Frosto, were inside the cage, people were tuning in. It wasn't a huge bumper difference, but there was no downturn in terms of the number of people who were tuning in. And then we've been really effective in terms of the utilization of a digital format and forum and going online and asking people via Twitter and Facebook different questions about what they'd like to see. We did that last season, and we asked, hey, there's an available spot on the TV show. Fans, what would you like to see? What fight would you like to see elevated to that nationally televised card reaching 85 million homes? Disproportionately, people came back and said, we want to see Lisa Ward Ellis versus Jessica Aguilar. So it's been interesting. I mean, I think there are some wildly talented women out there fighting right now who are really talented mixed martial artists, full-time mixed martial artists who legitimately can fight at an elite world-class level. So, and I think it makes for a very interesting story.
Back when I was a teenager, boxing was the big sport, and no one had really heard of mixed martial arts, and yet boxing ratings have gone down, and mixed martial arts have come up and sort of replaced it, if you will. What do you think the mistake was that boxing made?
You know, that kind of speaks to the core philosophy that makes Bellator different than any other mixed martial arts organization or any fighting organization in the world, and that is we have tried to become real sports competition. And when I say that, I mean everything we do is objective. Fighters at Bellator control their own destiny. It's a tournament format. You win, you move on, you lose, you go home. Just like football, baseball, basketball, soccer, hockey, golf, tennis, you name it. Those are real sports, and nobody in a suit like you or I sits behind a desk and subjectively determines who fights who for what and when. Well, as much of a disconnect it would be if the commissioner of the National Football League stood up after the Super Bowl this year and said, you know what, ratings perspective, we're going to do Dolphins versus Giants in the Super Bowl next year because they're major markets and we think that works. Nobody does that in other sports, and we don't do it at Bellator. I think one of the reasons that boxing's fallen off so substantially is because it is guided by and it lives by a philosophy of matchmaking. And that subjectivity, that lack of trackability, long term, I think serves to the detriment of fighting sports organizations. You can track the NCAAs in March Madness. You can track basketball, and you can see what happens in terms of who's added to the Clippers. And man, they may look strong this year, and they've really got a shot, and we're going to track them through the season and see if ultimately they can become LA's best basketball team. But when every piece of sport's determined by a guy in a shiny suit sitting behind a desk saying Smith versus Jones, because I believe I can sell that, I think that serves long-term to disconnect viewers from the reality of the sport's competition, and I think we've seen some of that in boxing. There are these steadfast characters in boxing from a promotional perspective that have been around forever, and they live and die by that maxim of we're going to decide who fights who for what and when. And I just think that both domestically and internationally, in the back of consumers' minds, we're used to seeing sports where if you win, you move forward, you go to the championship, and if you lose, you regroup, you retrain, you eat better, you run harder, and maybe you make it further next year. So I think that's one of the reasons that boxing's taken such a hit.
How big is MMA globally now, roughly, in terms of revenue? And in your view, how big could it become over the next 4 to 5 years?
Oh, it's enormous. Bellator Fighting Championships 3 years ago was a brand new company on a 6 million home universe, Spanish language. It's now partnered with Viacom, one of the largest, most powerful entertainment companies in the world, and is growing at an exponential rate. I think the opportunity for this sport internationally is enormous.
Well, Bellator's success is impressive, and its rise is certainly something we will keep an eye on.